What virtually every modern legal system in the world has acknowledged is that victims are fundamentally central to the justice system. They are people with dignity who cannot be instrumentalized purely for practical aims in a variety of cases in the legal system. We acknowledge this when many countries allow people to not press charges in cases where they are involved in crimes. We acknowledge this when we do not punish people or actively imply punitive fines if they do not call the police in a certain case because there are legitimate reasons for them to not want to engage with the justice system. We also acknowledge in modern legal systems that things like prosecutions aren't a totalizing good and an end all or be all. We acknowledge this through things like plea bargains or the existence of things like witness protection programs that are all better for the justice system and all acknowledge things like the dignity of victims that often are compromises we make for the betterment of the justice system. We're very, very happy in open government to align ourselves with principles of the justice system that do not instrumentalize victims by allowing victims to veto cases of prosecutions of their offenders in violent crimes. This is critical for a couple of reasons. I'm going to do a few things this speech. First, I'm going to give a clear model as to what we're talking about in this debate. Then I'm going to give two arguments. First, on the principled right on behalf of victims, and secondly, why the court cases that victims do choose to engage in become much more productive, much better, and lead to better outcomes in the legal system. Firstly, what are we largely talking about in this debate? We will allow victims of violent crimes prior to that case has happened to do one of four options that allow them to veto in some capacity. Firstly, they can choose to press charges, go through the normal criminal court process as they would typically, but secondly, we would allow them to, rather than have a criminal prosecution where the state takes the role of the prosecutor, we would allow them to take their perpetrators to civil courts for things like wrongful death suits, where the state provides legal support for them. Thirdly, we would allow them to accept things like guilty pleas if that is the thing that their perpetrator is providing. But fourthly, we would also allow them to drop charges entirely and not pursue a legal process because we acknowledge the dignity of victims is a thing that we ought to preserve. We say that no one is allowed to provide any personal benefit, i.e. transfers of compensation beforehand to victims, and we think that the state will ensure that these are decisions that are made in a secure manner, and we will not allow external influence on that victim. It is a choice that they make alone, and they get to choose between any of those options. We believe they are entirely all legitimate open government, and we do not need to make a value judgment which is taxable to the others. So, firstly, on the principled right to veto on behalf of victims, and this is critical because victims are unique, vulnerable actors in any justice system, which is to say that they're the people who are most centrally affected by a crime. This is one of the most traumatic events of a victim's life, and you fundamentally, in a criminal court, give up your power and your ability to have a say to the state, which becomes the prosecutor. You sacrifice your ability to seek an acknowledgement of what you consider justice for the state to be able to make those adjudications for you in a paternalistic way. For such a system to be justified, we posit that you must be able to have the ability to influence that state system around you in some way, the ability to determine to some extent what is justice. You ought balance the ability of the state to have efficacy with the rights of victims in these cases, which is why it's important to allow victims to choose the level of engagement they choose with the justice system. But furthermore, we think it's a violation of the consent of the victim in terms of this is the most personal event to them, and they're the ones who are the most directly affected, not a state that is likely unfeeling, that is not directly impacted by the event to the same extent that the victim is. They ought to have a say in this. What are the legitimate reasons for someone to do this? And we're going to stand for an open government that there are entirely legitimate reasons why you would not engage with the justice system that are entirely legitimate to you as a victim. What are those reasons? We think that there are three broad reasons why someone would choose to not engage with the legal system in this way. Firstly, because the criminal court process itself is incredibly grueling and intensive on behalf of victims. It is often one of the most difficult experiences of your life. It can often be deeply humiliating when you are questioned by an adversarial legal system about your deepest experiences that have deeply impacted you. But secondly, it's often because sometimes the victims might legitimately think that the state's punishment is misaligned with the harm that they experience or how much they want to affect that person's life in the future. It is entirely possible that someone thinks the state is being too punitive, especially given that there are tons of states that have extremely punitive laws. But thirdly, it's entirely possible that you would just rather seek compensation because you do not think that it's beneficial for the compensation to go to the state in terms of fines, and you would rather use that money to productively build your life. That looks like in the prosecution of O.J. Simpson, just being able to sue in civil courts for wrongful death because victims believed that that was a better thing that was more aligned with their personal interests in that case and would equally be able to deter those crimes in the future. Those are all reasons why this is a legitimate choice. Why is this a free and informed choice? One, because the state has the most information in this case to provide clear options as to when you're the state, you can provide information on the likely outcome of different options. What is the likelihood or the projected outcome of a criminal trial versus a civil court? You can easily provide this to victims. But even if this isn't a perfectly free choice, to preempt any challenges from opposition, there are two things here. Firstly, just the feeling of autonomy that you have, being greater on our side, is itself a benefit insofar as victims do not have autonomy in the status quo. Even if this is slightly a constrained choice because you are under some sort of stress, this is more autonomy than you will ever get in opposition. But secondly, this is not distinct from all other choices. All choices to call the police, all choices to become a victim, all choices to press charges are always necessarily under some stress or external influence. This is not a unique choice from the other things that the criminal justice system subjects individuals to do. Note, the crux of this argument is all of the reasons we've established for why someone would not want to do this are all entirely principally legitimate. And the very fact that different countries all around the world have different legal systems where some already allow things like civil court prosecutions instead of criminal court implies that there is no single objective or correct answer as to what is the best for victims. Therefore, you ought let victims decide insofar as they are the most impactful and the most capable of deciding. Secondly, why does this mean that the court cases that victims do engage with are far, far better and more productive? Firstly, often victims will not want to engage with the adversarial legal system for a lot of legitimate reasons, as far as it's often deeply humiliating. You are questioned about very personal impacts of your life, and often the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt makes it extremely difficult for you to ever win your cases. If we do not provide an alternative for victims, likely what happens in the counterfactual is A, individuals go through extreme amounts of trauma for no benefit at the end of it, but also it likely means that they might not become a witness in the first place. They might not choose to pick up the phone to call the police. They might not choose to come forward insofar as they do not feel like this is something that's going to be beneficial to them. This is the worst possible thing for justice because not only is the individual subjected to harm, but they do not see a prosecution at the end of it. That leads to an increase of crime when you get the narrative that people are not being punished for various crimes because victims do not want to come forward in the first place. That is a massive harm on future victims who we ought to prioritize because numerically they're a huge group and you can prevent the harm altogether from occurring to them. Secondly, compensation is often super, super valuable to these people for a lot of reasons. Say if you are a low-income victim of a crime, or you are a victim of a crime that is deeply humiliating, or you feel like you will be socially ostracized for it, think things like harassment or assault. Or if you are like a sex worker who has suffered something like harassment on the street. Often, the thing that is best for you is not for someone to be fined and then it goes to the state, which very indirectly helps you, but it is for you to get that money to be able to directly rebuild your life and ensure you have the agency to be able to create a better circumstance for yourself, for you to be able to move to another community, for you to be able to ever feel safe again, for you to have the ability to do things that make your life tangibly better. Those are all reasons why you are likely to want that. But thirdly, you are more likely to win trials in the first place because civil courts operate on a balance of probabilities of whether or not it's likely that someone caused harm to you, not the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is extremely difficult to prove for a lot of victims. On opening government, we better help people in a tangible way. We prevent future crimes when victims are willing to come forward. And even if you don't buy any of that, this is absolutely principally justified. We propose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Am I audible? Make no mistake, opening opposition also recognizes the importance of victims having agency and choice in the decisions that are made upon them. What I think opening government fails to realize, though, is that the victims of violent crime are not simply the ones who happen to be in that specific prosecution at that specific time with the choice to veto that decision. There are future victims to consider. There are broader societal outcomes to also consider. And these are the things that we're going to weigh out on opening opposition. Two arguments in the speech. First, how this action diminishes the ability of the courts to exercise justice at large, not only for present victims, but for future ones and for other goals the justice system seeks to accomplish. And then secondly, why giving the choice to a victim is not a form of maximal agency as OG would suggest, and in fact may lead to lots of pressure and community problems for those individuals. Before that though, I just want to point out two things with OG that I disagree with. First is the excessive fiat in the PM speech. When Eric states, for instance, that you can do things like stop bribes, which happen in all the other analogies that he makes, like things like dropping charges or reducing sentencing. We can claim that there are power dynamics that exist in this process itself that cannot be simply fiated out as they would claim. Second is that it's not always the case that an individual can on their own make the decision to drop charges or not do these things in dealing with the analogies that he draws in his speech. The state often brings cases itself as its own prosecutor and actor because the atrocities committed against some victims have repercussions for society at large. These are the things that we're going to deal with in this case. First argument then, how does this diminish the ability of courts to exercise justice? The first thing that I want to frame that will guide the rest of the analysis is the power dynamics that exists in this particular process. The people who are likely to wield this influence are twofold. First, authority figures with either state influence, bureaucratic influence, lots of money to be able to reach settlements, things of that nature, or even more perniciously, people who were close to the victims themselves, because oftentimes violent crime tends to be committed upon people that you know that are in your community. These are religious leaders, these are patriarchal figures that exercise outsized power over you as the victim, particularly in violent crime. Second, then, is family members who are often the victims of abuse from one another. So, with that out of the way, how do we harm the justice system? The first thing that I want to weigh on this question of victims is future victims. This is our first contribution on OO. How are future victims likely to be affected by this policy? The absence of a prosecution of a violent crime means that violent criminals are likely to recommit crimes even if they were reported to be possibly a danger to society. And the reason why is because violent criminals tend to, on average, pose a far greater risk of recidivism of sorts, especially against community and family members. Like we see recidivism of domestic abuse all the time that is likely to occur on their side. Moreover, these are people that are likely not to have internalized the punishment, not simply because they escaped from a prosecution, but because they know that they exercise their power in relationship over that other individual to get out of it. That's why you're likely to get future victims. But even if you don't get future victims often, the fact that you can get some is extremely important, and here's why. Here's why we care about future victims more than current victims. We're not going to dismiss the atrocities committed against victims of violent crime. What we're saying then is that that crime, A, has already happened, and there is nothing that the state can do to undo that. So where does the state owe responsibility, and who does it owe responsibility to? To future victims that it can prevent crime from happening against in the future. Second reason why we weigh future victims more is just there's the possibility of more of them existing than that one individual being able to make that choice. The third reason why we care about them more is because they lack the agency that is required in this particular process to make this decision. While you may have the agency of that one victim of violent crime, you do not have the consent of those who are going to be affected by that future criminal or that recidivist criminal in the future. Those are the people that we care about because we cannot recognize their agency and choice. So if choice is a metric upon which you should judge this debate, weigh it for opposition, because the choice and the ability to make decisions for future victims to opt out of that violence cannot be afforded to them because one person today is making that choice. Second thing on how this harms the ability to exercise justice is that it shows distinct privilege within the justice system. This fits within the framing about power and wealth being extremely strong determinants of how likely a person is to come out with a veto in this negotiation process. It's also about family dynamics and the relationships that exist there that make plain and clear that when an individual escaped a prosecution that the state was ready to act upon, but that the victim vetoed it, that they were able to escape justice when everybody else was ready to endow it upon them. Third thing, it prevents deterrence. Why? Because people who are wealthy primarily and can reach a lot of these settlements now have the opportunity to commit certain crimes with impunity without the fear of a state intervening and being able to exercise that prosecution, which is important because it is different from cases where somebody would simply drop charges now because the state has its ability to prosecute someone removed in the interest of the general public. CG.
If you care so much about future victims, would you compel victims to testify on crimes even if they don't want to?
If it's in the interest of future victims who want someone prosecuted, we might consider it, sure. But I think that's a different debate. So, third thing is perceptions of the justice system. People tend to trust it far less and be willing to go to it less because they feel like they are in a power imbalance. Leads to my second argument then, about why this is not a choice that is fair to impose upon a person. We told you that offenders in these situations, violent offenders at that, have three options. They buy you off. Because we know they're violent, they might threaten you or your family, or they might inspire great guilt and pressure from your community. The two first are obviously dangerous harms, but I want to address the third one because it's probably the one that applies in the most cases, on community pressure. It's your religious figure telling you that you're going to be banished or shamed by your community if you press charges against them and continue. It's you feeling guilt that your family is in jail because of you. And the key here is this, that the onus With this option available, ultimately falls on the victim to make this decision, as opposed to them not living with that because it was a court as an independent arbiter making that decision. Don't force them into this pressure. Don't make them live with this guilt. We think those are unacceptable choices and not maximal agency, as OG would suggest. Proudly oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the government.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, cool. Okay. Let's 3, 2, 1, let's go. The biggest, like the absolute biggest issue with opening opposition so far is that they assumed prosecuting someone, the act in and of itself, gets you any sort of deterrence, gets you any sort of rehabilitation. When Eric has already told you, in the overwhelming majority of these cases, if these victims would rather have not fought these court cases, either dropped it or gone to a civil court or gone for a guilty plea, they are highly unlikely to testify. Even if Gauthier wants to force this victim of sexual assault to testify for future victims, they are highly unlikely to be prepared for the type of grilling and rigor that you need in order to win that case. The state can launch the prosecution on their side without the key witness actually be someone who has the willingness and the ability to go through with the case. In the overwhelming majority of cases, they lose. That means that most of their arguments that sort of hinge on you successfully prosecuting these people in order to have deterrence really crumble. Because I want to point out, when you prosecute someone but fail repetitively, it has the opposite effect of deterrence and rehabilitation. The person who you failed to prosecute now knows that they can get away with the crime again because the justice system cannot catch them. The other people who are watching the case now know that they can commit crimes because they realize the justice system can't prosecute them. This gets even more true in these weird examples of gangsters who are going to come to your house and threaten to kill your family. You will just, as a victim, either not testify or give some sort of weird testimony that indicates that you were not actually targeted upon. And in that case, it completely takes off all of the deterrence and retribution that they want to talk about. So at the end of the day, we do not think they have a strong principle stand. So first, let's go on to the principle that we hold, explain why victims matter and why you cannot discard them in a blanket weighing of one person versus another, and then go into what their principle is. What were the central tenets on why we thought victims matter? Not in an overriding way, but they needed to be considered, which is they are centrally affected and principally they sacrifice their ability to get justice to the state, and the state has an obligation then to give them some power to choose what form of justice that they want to take. What was their response? Their response was a horrid, absolute abrogation of what the justice system stands for, which is future victims matter. They matter so much that we can forget our obligations to everyone else. If they took that principle to its fullest, then they would simply arrest people for super long periods and forget the idea of rehabilitation, because the idea of future victims matters significantly more. The justice system must balance the consideration of other people. Also, I'll show you how we win future victims as well later in the speech. I want to point to a couple of things though. Every single one of these outcomes is also possible in their world, because it is a lie to say that the state follows every single criminal case that lands on their desk. They choose who to prosecute based on how likely maybe they think they are for winning, based on how much star power it'll give you as an attorney. There are many things, but at the end of the day, it is not true that most criminal cases actually end up finding themselves in a criminal court. The only thing then is who makes that decision. Is it unilaterally the state, or does the victim also get a veto, which right now the state gets to do and doesn't always do for the sake of future victims? So at the end of the day, every single outcome a victim could choose is legitimate and a possible product of the justice system. The only question then is, should they have the ability to choose which of these four legitimate options is one that actually ends up happening in the real world. Next, on to the consent of the victim and their ability to make this choice. They had two horrible reasons in the power dynamic and one decent one. First, on the idea that you can bribe them, we can watch that. We can this is a logistical thing. We can stop them from bribing you. We can stop them from literally intimidating you and threatening you with your life with witness protection programs. But on the better part of this, on the societal and family and personal pressure, I think you need to look at the comparative, because the moment you think that there is significant pressure for you to not follow up on this case, you are highly unlikely to fight the case in their world. Even if the state unilaterally goes on this prosecution, they are highly likely to lose this case. What does this mean? Yes, maybe in this world, you would have ideally wanted to go for a criminal case, but because of societal pressure, you're forced to accept a guilty plea with lower punishment, but at least you have the fact that they were declared guilty. Maybe you go for a civil case where you're given a payout, and that's not what you want. You wanted them in prison. You have significantly higher agency on our choice, because while your consent will forever be compromised on both sides, you have options, many of which benefit you greatly and do not force you to go through the gutter of a criminal court case. And that is something that is extremely relevant. At the end of the day, we took consent away from victims, and you have an obligation to give it back. That deals with the vast majority of opening opposition. But what was the arguments that they had zero response to? Eric's second argument that notably proved that we help future victims. What were the three things we said? Number one, people won't report as much, especially if they're going to start forcing people to testify like the leader of opposition is so happy to do. People will simply not come forward with these crimes because we know that they do not want them to go to court cases. And on their side, you simply don't give them a choice. You know less about it. You can protect them less from domestic violence that might occur because you don't even know that they're at risk. These are horrible outcomes that might happen. But second, they fight the case and lose. Once again, huge for any deterrence that they might have. And third, on our side, we get civil cases where you get compensation, which you can then use to better your life. There's a key weighing over here. We get future victims better off and deterrents better off. Not only because we have more reporting and because we have better deterrents because the cases you do fight, you're more likely to win, but also past victims are the most likely stakeholder to become future victims. People who are in vulnerable situations of poverty, but are stuck there because they can't get themselves out of it. Before I go on, closing opposition.
Do you weigh the rights of two people as more important than the rights of one person?
Okay, fine. That's a very weird abstract question. So you got me there. I just want to refer back to our principle. All of these four outcomes are legitimate outcomes that, differing on the circumstances a state might pick. The only question then is, do we give some sort of agency to the victim to decide which of these legitimate outcomes, like class POI, good job. Cool. So future victims, why we absolutely empower them. Because at the end of the day, we are the only side that gives people the option of dragging themselves out of the instances that caused them to be in harm's way in the first place, to buy self-defense equipment for yourself, to get the ability to board private transport so you no longer have to go on dangerous subways at the middle of the night, to move away from the area that you were in, which is the reason why your house got broken into. If you fight civil cases and get compensation, which notably is much easier because you do not have to prove beyond reasonable doubt, you just need to prove on the balance of probabilities, which is why many criminal cases are better fought in a civil way. Those are things that you now have the ability to actively improve your life with. And that helps future victims because past victims are the most likely to become future victims. At the end of the day, we did not abandon victims in the pursuit of some radical justice system. We understood our obligations to them and gave them the choice they deserve. But also, we made society a place with better deterrence and better ability to prevent future crimes. Proud.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Thank you. I want to ask two questions, make two arguments in this debate. First of all, why it is that giving the victim the choice is worse than not giving them a choice at all, meeting the burden of OG. And secondly, why this fundamentally misses the obligations of the justice system. On the first, the best material we got in terms of practical impacts from opening government was that the victim doesn't report. But notably, there was very little comparative analysis in this material. Because realistically, I don't know what the difference is between the victim not reporting and the victim vetoing a prosecution if you can't put any legal charges on this person and can't protect this person anyways. There's realistically at best, very marginal impact of people not reporting if the only comparative OG has is them dropping the charges, them vetoing the prosecution in the very first place. Given that's the case then, why is it that giving the victim the choice and putting the illness on the victim, importantly, is comparatively harmful? The first thing we noted is that there are two potential offenders. The first one is one that has a massive power dynamic on you, i.e. someone like a boss, someone such as a religious figure, someone that has the money or has the ability to make a threat. The second option is someone like a family member, someone close to you. The important thing to note about this is that you are left with two options and both of them are awful. Why? Because I think the state deciding to prosecute this individual is a relief and a mercy to you compared to your two options. The first option is that you don't veto. What happens in that world? Three things. First of all, you live with the guilt of the person's punishment. If this person has a life sentence, you spend the rest of your life thinking you were the one that individually made this decision for this life sentence. The problem is that on our side, we take that away from the victim. We recognize that it was the judge's decision, it was the jury's decision, and they got what they deserved. But you live with the guilt because it was your decision. And when the criminal's families come up to you, they say it was your mistake and you should have vetoed, and you are the reason why this person is in jail. It's about the ways in which you perceive this justice. The second is that you receive shame from your community, from your family, from your friends. If you chose to prosecute a religious leader, or if you did not veto a religious leader's prosecution, then what that means is that the religious community that you live in shames you. If it is that you did not prosecute your father for assault, then your mother, if you did not veto your father for assault, then your mother blames you. You face massive shame from the people around you for not vetoing. The third thing is that you have regret for not taking money afterwards, right? If it is that you worry so much about compensation and you are a poor individual, you are forced into this decision. These three factors are important. Number one, because they identify that it is not a free choice, because if you do not veto, these are the harms that are pushed onto you. And two, it is reasons why it is that you're likely to be coerced to veto. What happens in the world in which you do veto? The first thing we noted is that it is not a free choice. But the second thing is that there are massive unexpected ramifications in the future. Because when it is this person inevitably recommits a crime, the future victim's harm and the violence perpetuated on them is put onto your emotional conscience and your emotional pain as well. You live with that guilt afterwards. So even in the best case scenario of Gov, even then, this choice emotionally destroys people. And given that's the case then, we think that giving it to the state is a mercy to these individuals in an already awful situation. Second argument then, why is it that this is still fundamentally unjust? What did we get out of Gov here? To be honest, a lot of the principles that you've gotten from Gov so far have been based off of analogies about other things that we do, or intuition pumps based off of just saying, oh, the victim is the most important, the victim's the most important, with very little analysis as to why. But let's see if they actually fulfill the principled obligation that they want to. Because the two options they have instead of the criminal court process is a civil court or dropping the charges entirely. So the main problem that they identify is the criminal court process is grueling, you get interrogated. But the question then is, do either of their two comparatives fix this? Let's say that the alternative is a civil court. Even if it is the case that you have to do things such as the balance of probabilities, even then you're also going to be interrogated by lawyers. I don't know why this is going to be any marginal difference just because it's balance of probabilities rather than innocent until proven guilty. The second option then is that you drop the charges entirely, in which case then the comparative you could have chosen instead is just not testifying and getting other witnesses to testify about this instead, if you're genuinely worried that much about the interrogation. And that's probably comparatively better and more likely that you get some sort of punishment than the world in which you just decide to drop the charges entirely. So given that's the case then, both the alternatives that government gives you do not fulfill their own principled obligation, because the alternative is either no punishment or also a grueling process that is fully filled in civil courts. Given then that OG do not meet their principal obligation, what are the other principled obligations in the debate? Why do they matter? Moving past the analogies and the intuition pumps. The first one is on future victims. The reason why we know future victims are more important is because at best, we can, I'll take you in a sec, CG. At best, we can mitigate the harms to the current victim. But we know future victims matter more because we prefer a world in which this harm never happened in the very first place. Because those future victims don't have consent. At best, OG can mitigate. On our side, we can prevent. Go ahead, CG.
Yeah, so if you say that these women or these people are going to feel so guilty about locking someone up for the rest of their life, it kind of sounds like they really personally, genuinely don't want this person to go to jail. Are there not legitimate reasons why a person might not want their offender to go to jail?
Okay, but this is the difference, right? On our side, they probably get some sort of relief knowing that this person that did something very traumatic to them is in jail, but it was the state's responsibility ultimately. When you put this choice on the victim, they feel the individual guilt for this person. And that means that when they should be focusing on recovering from their trauma, they have to focus about the person that committed the trauma instead. So clearly future victims are more important. The next clash then is on deterrence. The response to deterrence was, what if you fail? But first of all, it is significantly more likely that you succeed than in their world when they drop charges. And secondly, it's about what the deterrence effect is, which is if it is that you bring this person this close to getting a sentence, if it is that this prosecution happens and the court case happens and they're inches away from getting into jail, I think even that is significantly better for a deterrence effect. Goti also identifies for you the instances of privilege and why that leads to unequal justice, the community harms as well. This is fundamentally unjust and is awful for the victim. Proud to stand on all.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the government.
Can people hear me? Can I take that as a yes? What the intellectual masturbation of the opening half has ignored is that crime is intimate. Crime is a phenomenon within communities, within families, within relationships. The closing government extension is going to be very simple, that in many cases, prosecution tears apart communities and families in a way that ultimately makes both victims and perpetrators worse off. Very simple extension, the bottle will be integrated. But first, one comment on opening up, because I think that ultimately the biggest damnation of their case is that the worst impacts just don't exist. Like, I want to be clear, why do we think that on a top level, just weighing the impact that opening opposition brings you does not matter? Because I think that the worst harm they can bring to you, like a couple of reasons to believe that if we bite the worst case that some future victims are hurt, we are still winning. Why is it the case? Because the criminal justice system is so abhorrent and over punishes people to such a massive extent that the degree of harm it causes to defendants is actually worse than the one that is actually caused to the victims themselves. When someone who commits a burglary goes to jail for 10 years, when someone who commits an armed robbery as a teenager who is hopped up on drugs goes to jail for the rest of their life or commits even a heinous crime, the people who suffer things that literally don't deserve the punishments that they beat out are so badly hurt that this actually is more important. But secondly, I just think that locking people up increases their recidivism rather than reducing it. OG touches on this, but they just missed the general idea that locking people up makes them more likely to commit crimes in the future because they are cut off from networks, they're cut off from people who could provide social support and reduce their willingness to commit crimes in the first place. That means their future victim spiel is a total lie because they increase the number of crimes that are committed in the future. Insofar as OO is not locking people up forever if they ever committed a crime, the whole future victim spiel does not make any sense, totally out of this debate. The rest of the rebuttal will be integrated. So a very simple extension. Why does prosecution tear apart communities? I think the characterization of crime in this debate from opening government is absolutely unhinged. It's like every crime is sexual assault by a stranger. This is ludicrous. The vast majority of crimes, as OO correctly identifies, are committed by community members and people who are around you. I think, though, that there are black and white view of the situation in which the victim is just a single oppressed person surrounded by everyone, and the best thing to do for them is to just remove this person from their circumstance is actually wrong. There are three major reasons. Like just the basic context you want to establish is that often these are things like a teenager in your neighborhood, like holds up a neighborhood grocery I think that may go to jail for several years for. It's like an abusive husband who is put on charge for domestic violence. But if they go to jail, your children grow up without a father and you lose income and suffer to desperate poverty. I think that in these cases, the prosecution should be in the hands of victims. The first reason is that it is genuinely unclear what is best for them in the first place. That is, it is so difficult to understand in a situation like if there is an abusive husband and you have the choice between being free of the abuse, but you might also lose sources of stability and maybe role model, like just like the ability for your children to have a parent. These are things that are genuinely difficult decisions that the state simply cannot decide in a meaningful way, that only individuals can decide what the best outcome in that situation is. The second reason why this might be extremely important is that even if you want restitution, you may recognize that the criminal justice system is absurdly punitive, that the fact that your teenager held up a grocery store is not a reason why they should go to jail for 10 years, or even the fact that they assaulted someone is not the reason why they should have their entire future ruined in the first place. The third reason why this might be extremely important is because these people know that prosecutors with political ambitions will ultimately use this case to paint the community as a crime-ridden ghetto. The TPM says a little bit about prosecutors' incentives, but misses a really important aspect of it. That is, the real harm about prosecutors' incentives is that they have an incentive to paint the communities that have these crimes as part of them as being really harmful places, because that is how they get better political careers. Firstly, they want to paint themselves as tough on crime. That means that they have to paint a major problem of crime for you to believe that they are necessary, that their goal is actually helpful. And secondly, they have an incentive to take things like the CCTV footage of a Hispanic youth robbing a grocery store and say that this is a dangerous criminal who I locked away. This means that they're likely to do things like have extremely trumped up charges that have extremely high rates of high sentences, and say that this is someone who is a dangerous threat to society. This is something that OG touches on in the context of like, this is generally bad. I think this is particularly bad for communities. I think there are two major impacts to this argument. Firstly, entire communities can suffer from the process because people who are within the community are torn apart, especially younger people who are often the most susceptible to crime, who are the most susceptible to joining gangs. People who are the future of these communities are torn and sent to jail for literally 10 years. And the fact that the community loses people, like the fact that African-American neighborhoods have literally become matrilineal as the fact, matrilocal as the function of the fact that so many black men are in jail that they literally do not have the ability to set up households with black men. The fact that there are so many people who don't have the ability to have any kind of household is just really harmful. The second major impact of this argument is that I think this makes communities significantly more likely to distrust the process as a whole. That is, they're much less likely to report crimes in the future. They're much less likely to report any kinds of instances. OG talks about this in the context of individuals, but in the context of individuals, it doesn't make any sense. It's much more impactful in the context of communities, because that's where much larger scopes of people are affected by this argument. And the third reason why this is really important is because if for some reason you want to vote on the really dumb principle that happened in the opening half, this is what gives you. As the DLO rightly points out, OG's principle is just like a bunch of abstractions and analogies that don't really have any kind of analysis specific to this notion. I think that our extension is the effect of that they must have the autonomy to do so, not simply because of the general abstractions about victims having a right in the process like OG wanted to talk about. Okay, a little bit more integrated rebuttal to OO, but first I'll take a few out from CO.
Great. Do you think that it's a good narrative to have that the victims are the ones who are responsible for all of the ills and biases of the criminal justice system?
Okay, two responses. Firstly, I don't think this actually does spread that narrative. I think that this can be used by victims to say, for example, the criminal justice system is absurd. Like the fact that this teenager is getting 10 years in prison is one that they can actually shine a light on, and shine a light on the other harms of the system, which they can do because they're much more sympathetic. But secondly, I often don't think this as narrative actually matters in the main context of this debate. More concrete impacts about how communities are torn apart are much more important than a vague narrative that's going to be less impactful to people. A couple of integrated rebuttals to OO. They say community pressure and power dynamics will lead you to stop reporting. This is their main rebuttal, so this is preemptive rebuttal to this. Firstly, if the community or people in power in your neighborhood are pressuring you, like for example, women in conservative societies in India, this is totally non-unique because it will also prevent you from doing things like reporting the crime in the first place, from filing a FIR, from actually having the ability to stop this in the first place. This context is totally non-unique. Therefore, the context in which you have to debate this is one where victims do have some choice, because if they don't have choice, literally nothing is going to change in either world. Secondly, it's often not pressure, it's the fact that you actually care about them. So when OO says you feel guilty, this is laughable, because if you actually feel guilty, that means that you prefer a world in which they didn't go to the jail for the rest of their life. That means that you want to stop them. So we actually want that to stop in the first place. Ultimately, then, the most important argument is about communities. It's about how communities are torn apart in Up's world, that people suffer from them, that they don't get businesses to invest in them, that they don't get people to survive and the community to thrive. That is more important than all the principled nonsense of the opening half. Very proud to stand on closing government.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
Yeah, just 1 second. Okay. For POIs, you can just type them into chat, and if I still don't take one by 6 minutes, you can also shout it out if you really want to ask one. And yeah, so 3, 2, 1. So according to Team according to closing a proposition, what has basically happened in this particular debate is that victims who are already facing the kind of violence that they've faced in this particular model of uniquely violent crimes, including things like rape, including things like sexual violence, including things like potentially murder, now have to suddenly protect the honor of their entire community. So not only are people that are already marginalized within these communities, for example, women, for example, as proposition also mentioned uniquely, for example, Black women that might not only face racialized violence, but also face patriarchal violence, for example, Black men, now have to suddenly bear the entire burden of protecting community laws and protecting the honor of the men in their community. One, that's problematic. Two, they brought up examples of cases like robbery and like meager assaults that are happening in the status quo. This debate is not about these kinds of things like someone stealing, for example, a candy bar from the local store, right? This is about violent cases that have happened, for example, intimate partner violence, where you have cases of like multiple rape instances, etc., that are taking place. So reducing this to, for example, things like like a local like boy getting like a sentence that's longer than what he deserved is like completely unfair in this particular model, and something that we feel like is not what this debate is basically contesting. But on a greater model, it's not the victim's responsibility to basically protect issues, even if the state, for example, let's say, is racialized or is patriarchal in particular nature. It's not the victim's responsibility to be conscious of these kinds of things when they bring these cases to the states. Why is that? It's the same thing, for example, as casting a vote, right? You can be conscious of the fact that voting, for example, might be an election, might be rigged, but it's not your responsibility to not cast a vote in order to basically stand opposed to this rigged election system, right? We're unfairly putting the burden both of like protecting and making the system better, but also of representing the organization and community better on the victim. And we feel like this is an unfair burden to basically put on a particular person that has already gone through so much violence. So what does become the important particular case in this particular debate? I think we can totally ignore what closing government brought up on this model and move on to the actual issues of today's debate. I'm going to run this debate on three major issues. The first issue being who protects victims better. The second issue being who ensures that the state follows their designated responsibility better. And then thirdly, like an extension that we're going to run on how prosecutors can also exploit victims in these particular cases even more than they might already be being if the state is literally like the kind of like fucked up model that proposition makes you believe. So let's start with the first issue, like who protects victims better. Team proposition has you believe that victims, for example, are people that are like uniquely affected by like violent things, and that's true. But we also tell you that they're not able to make impartial choices in these particular cases, not only because of the kind of like guilty mechanisms that opening opposition ran, but also because of inherent violence they might face if they return to their communities, right? So, for example, what happens in these particular cases is that victims face like pressure from their families, not only to, for example, let their brothers or their fathers go, but they might also return to their homes with the exact brothers and fathers that have violated them in the first place and experience like a second violated offense take place one more time. Why is it that this particular case is not non-unique as opposition has you believe? Is because in this particular model, when you allow these women to basically get away, for example, with vetoing those decisions, it makes it even worse because the family realizes that there's ways in which they can effectively intervene. But on a secondary mode, I'm also going to run this argument about how the state's intention to intervene might even further decrease in this particular case because of the kind of things that they're basically doing. But I'm going to get to that later on. But not only are victims facing pressure from these kinds of things, we tell you on a comparative scale, what proposition is basically offering you is that these victims don't go to these courts, but rather settle down with, for example, the person that's oppressed them or violated them. We tell you that these are people that uniquely hold more power than them in these particular cases. And in a state versus like this person comparative, the state is likely to protect you even more, even if it is a paternalistic state at a base level, it has a more of an incentive to protect you just by virtue, for example, say the social contract or by the fact that they have like a systemic like group of people that they need to protect or like a second case of offense versus compared to someone that's likely to like not only cause you more harm, but now realizes that you're in a position that you realize that you no longer can sort of like intervene in this particular issue, and they're likely to exploit this, for example, to like make this case even worse for you, and therefore like the financial sort of settlement might be even worse in this particular model. But the illegitimacy of this choice goes even further in these particular cases. Why? Because of things like capital division, because of things like racial division that are basically present between the oppressor and usually the oppressed, right? These are violent crimes that don't happen in absentia. These happen uniquely to, for example, women of color. These happen uniquely to, for example, people who, these are uniquely committed by those who hold power, and these are uniquely repeat offenses that take place against these people, right? And we tell you that's exactly the kind of things that make this even more problematic, and women are threatened, for example, by losing their children, by facing the same kind of offense one more time. And these are the kind of reasons why we tell you that this isn't an impartial choice that's based on like a guilty mechanism, but actual harm that might be caused upon their bodies one more time. But on a net, in this particular case, who protects victims better? We tell you in this particular case, we protect victims better by upholding the second issue and by winning the second issue in this particular debate. And what is that? Who ensures that the state follows their designated responsibility? Let's take two particular models. Let's say the state does not give a shit about these victims, right? In that particular case, like if the state does not give a shit whatsoever, it only takes either winnable cases as supreme proposition. How do you believe? Well, that's fucking great, right? If the state takes only winnable cases, fine, they'll win these short number of cases. We tell you that's even better than, for example, victims settling down and like having worse off financial policies being made for them. And if they do win these winnable cases, you'll have things like precedent, you'll have things like deterrence set about in this particular model. But let's say that the state does not take this case and even gives less of a shit when you allow like I'll take in a minute, when you basically allow things like veto power, what does this particular case do is that it makes three ways in which the system gets worse. One, it makes the role of the courts redundant. They might feel like they no longer have a control, and therefore their policy might start dwindling even more than it already has. And therefore, even the few cases that do come to the court are going to be worse off. On a second, it might makes for differing policies. So, for example, if one victim vetoes and the other doesn't, the kind of precedent that exists for newer victims to come about and like sort of fight these cases no longer is the same. So you don't have the kind of historic precedent for fighting sexual offense cases present in the court system. And on third note, this is the new extension that we're bringing to this debate, is also this idea of overwhelmed prosecutors, right? So a lot of the times prosecutors are overwhelmed with a large number of cases. What happens if they get that they can pressurize these victims into vetoing this particular case, is that they might also pressurize victims that do want the state to fight this case to veto the case in their particular model, so that they can have their conviction rates like go up. And like, for example, if they feel like a case is not winnable, they might pressure this particular victim in order to veto this particular case, but they don't know how to run it, right? Because that's exactly the kind of problematic things that happen in the state doesn't give a shit. Before I move on to the state that does give a shit, I'll take opening government.
The ability to get compensation through civil courts on our side is exactly what counteracts those social pressures. Because if you are pressured by a religious leader or your family, you can now know that you can get compensation to rebuild your life. Under your side, you face that shame and pressure, meaning the only option is to not come forward in the first place.
We tell you that you don't face the same kind of like legal pressure or whatever, because you're able to like not only get into these cases, but we get more winnable cases on our side of the model because the court system is just effectively better at the end of the day. Let's go back to the kind of argument that I was making about the case in which the state does give a shit, right? The most likely chance is that the state does give a shit. Why is this one? Because of like social contract with this independent individual like worker as well. The state might be a paternalistic state even, but it does give more of a shit about these people than it does give about, for example, like let's say offenders, right? And these also like the state has like sort of a formal like popular stance that it needs to like support, and it needs like public support, for example. And a lot of these violent cases are, for example, in media attention, as the entire room has agreed, right? It's exactly why the state will have like an incentive to sort of protect these citizens. But on secondary note, we do think that the case of like repeat offenses is uniquely important in this particular case. Why? Because not only is there a chance of like this person like repeat offending somebody else, but also we're like repeatedly offending like the same exact person, and that's exactly where we feel like this kind of repeat offense situation becomes uniquely important. But on second, we also feel like the state is likely to intervene in this particular case more than your family does, because your family is literally fucked up, right? A lot of these cases are come directly against, like, for example, as people mentioned already, religious leaders, family members, father figures, etc. And we feel like that's exactly where you fight the state intervention, instead of going back to like the same house, is much better in this particular case. And let's take the actual example where they do take this money. Your family is also likely to take this money from you, right? Because you're going back to the same exact household. We tell you that what you need is support in these particular cases, and the state can definitely support you better than the paternalistic family that you have. Okay, so I still have time. I'm going to run another extension. The last extension we basically wanted to run in this particular model was actually flip the model that closing government basically presented to you of like racialized victims, right? We tell you in a lot of these cases, for example, when you have like specific victims that might be facing like racialized crimes, etc., such as like, let's say, they might be able to like get out on bail, etc. You might also have, for example, victims like white victims get like a large amounts of like overrule things like bail for like men of color that might have not committed this crime, right? We tell you it's exactly these kinds of reasons in which why we would also not want like the victims to be able to veto, and the victims might have like uniquely more racial capital or uniquely more class capital than the person who's causing this offense. We think this is a very unlikely model. But even if you take the fact that they have like this unique amount of like larger racial or social capital, they will be able to like veto this decision that would cause unique harm to the kind of community men that closing government really wants to protect. And that's exactly the kind of people we're protecting by state intervention. Again, the state is better like financed in this particular case, or like has better capital to sort of carry out these decisions. So on net, what have we shown to you today? We've shown to you, one, we're protecting your victims better. How? Because we're basically giving them the opportunity to like have the state intervene on their behalf, and the state is willing to intervene, A, because of like a popularistic stance, because of like wanting winnable cases, two, because there's a social contract, three, because they care about these victims. But on a secondary note, we've also shown to you that these victims are likely to be better off in this particular case, because the alternative model is where they have to like succumb to family pressure, and like family pressure doesn't necessarily translate into like guilty things like opening government has shown, opening opposition has shown to you, but actual physical harm that might be caused to these particular victims, and like potential for like repeat offenses. We've also shown to you how in our particular model, the state like fulfills their designated responsibility. The state fulfills their designated responsibility much better than the kind of like arguments that proposition have set for you. For all of these reasons, please vote side opposition.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the government.
Just 1 second. Just a second. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First, an explanation of why our extension places us head and shoulders above the rest in this debate. Second, responses to closing opposition. Finally, comments about the top half. Let's start with the extension, because we actually differ from every other team in this debate. All the other teams say that when victims are harmed, it's really bad, and we should protect them in some way, shape, or form. But what we say on closing government is a little bit different. And that is the criminal justice system in the vast majority of the world, specifically in the US, which is relevant given that it has the highest number of incarcerated people ever, actually is a tool that abuses everyone it locks up in a very significant way. And that is, victims on the ground might actually feel like they want to prevent the other members of their community from being dragged through hell through the criminal justice system. And this is really important. I want to just give it to you as an example. If you look at some of the most over-policed parts of the United States, members of that community most often will be people of color, black, etc., don't trust the police. They don't trust what the state is doing to their people. They don't trust the fact that there's 73% of all incarcerated people in the United States are black. And what they realize is that any person who commits a crime against them, maybe it's a youth who breaks into their house and steals something, maybe it's someone who beats them up while they're on the street, maybe it's a mugging, etc., despite what they've done to them, they don't deserve that horrible fate that awaits at the end of the criminal justice system. And that, I think, is a very legitimate reason for people to have the choice to not prosecute. And this is super crucial, because the assumption here is that it's a coercive choice that is forced upon these people by their communities, by power dynamics, as both OO says and then CO repeats. While this might be true, it completely ignores the millions of African Americans who would much rather see people who commit crimes against them if they are black and from an already over-policed community get off scot-free than actually go to jail. This is a preference that is super unique in this debate for a few structural reasons. Number one, it is the best in Mex. It's the best recognition. It's the best understanding of what victims actually want, which is an important consideration. But two, it actually has huge impacts for people on the ground. Like, I think very simply, if we can reduce the number of people incarcerated for stupid offenses and who are dragged through the criminal justice system, who lose their jobs because they have the criminal record and are likely to recidivate, at a scale of impact that is huge. Recognize what we're talking about here. If just in the United States alone, we can reduce the number of incarcerated people for dumb things by 10% because members of their communities who happen to be their victims don't want that outcome to happen, then that is a huge human cost that we are winning on side closing government that I think is more important than any of the principal argumentation we get, and why it's more important than even potential risk of future crime in the long run. But second, why is it the case that you have such a high over-incarceration rate for certain types of offenses? Karthik gives this to you in his case and we get no response. And that is, prosecutors have an incentive to actively find cases that are slam dunks for them and then use those cases to bolster their win records. This is exactly why you have such an over-incarceration problem in the United States, in addition to things like a private prison lobby, etc. Why is this so important? Because these incentives are structural and will never change. The only way to counteract them is, one, you either give more funding to public defenders, which we know is not going to happen for a number of structural reasons, or you give power to community members themselves to choose to forgive people who commit crimes if it means that they are not going to become another horrible statistic in an already horrible police state. And I think that is a legitimate choice that Karthik brings to you in extension. So on a weighing level, we give you the actual structural incentives as to why the people who are likely to suffer from these things are people who commit minor offenses. CO says in response that no, actually it's not. We only have to care about people who commit very intimate, extremely violent crimes. I'm not sure why this is true. If you look at the numbers in a place like the United States, the vast majority of people who are incarcerated for minor offenses, mildly violent, robberies, thefts, and they were dragged through the criminal justice system because of a lot of archaic laws. This is the reality. These are what crimes look like on the ground. And these are the easiest ones for prosecutors to prosecute because they have something like CCTV footage, or they're able to twist the arm of the overworked public defender and force that public defender to agree to a plea deal. All of these things mean that huge harm is committed to these communities because prosecutors are able to weaponize the criminal justice system and communities themselves have no defense against this whatsoever. Giving them the choice is a huge benefit for two additional reasons. First, it is the state that has actively used the criminal justice system as a weapon against them. It means that they have no ability to consent into it or out of it. If you want to talk about consent issues that OO talks about when you talk about consenting into future crimes, I'm sorry, no one chooses to opt into a criminal justice system that's going to turn you into a criminal if you commit a minor crime. So on the question of consent, it's important to give the community that ability to choose how those impacts accrue to them. But the second reason, I think it's just a huge human level. Jail is over punitive, it is horrible, and it destroys people's lives, it destroys communities around them, which means that it is impossible for those communities to ever uplift themselves. It means that when the prosecutor smears that community in the trial, no one ever wants to invest in that neighborhood, no one ever wants to go there, which further dooms that community to a cycle of poverty when they're branded or when they become a case study for broken windows policing. These are all huge impacts that actually genuinely accrue to millions of people in the United States, which might as well be the best case example for this debate, given the scale at which that operates in terms of the quantification of these impacts. If we can reduce this even by 10 or 15%, that is sufficient for closing government to win this debate. But second, Karthik talks about other material in his speech when he says that it's not just about sort of racialized crime, it's also about other intimate things that involve family members, which if you remove that family member from the structure, it could ruin that victim's life in a more pernicious way. And insofar as that's the case, choice should be given to the people who will have to bear the actual long-term consequences of that incarceration when it happens. Let's respond to closing opposition. By the way, on a question of magnitude and consideration, this is the most important issue in the debate. It takes us over the other two teams. Let's respond to what we heard from closing opposition. Closing opposition said marginalized people should not have to protect the honor of their community. But this is true in the status quo, right? Like if you go to a place like India, you never report any action that happens to you in the first place because you are still expected to protect the honor of your community. Yes, there's one additional way you can opt out of charges, but it is very marginal. The delta in terms of how engaged people are with the criminal justice system doesn't change in these instances. So we ought to care about individuals whose lives are actually ripped apart for no fault of their own because of an over-punitive system, where we can actually do something in those instances where the victims themselves don't want to see another black youth go to jail for the rest of his life because of a stupid 3 strikes and you're outlaw in a place like Louisiana. But additionally, let's note here, it's not about moral obligation. It's about concrete benefits. They suffer. The people who are marginalized suffer, as CEO would talk to you about. Black women suffer the most from mass incarceration of black men. We want them to suffer less on our side. It's also not purely about the most violent crimes. We also talk about instances of how it can involve partner violence, etc. Worst case, however, we are okay with social pressure because it's countervailed by state pressure. And every decision about something like the criminal justice is difficult. If worst harm is that people who will just the worst harm is that people will just to the fact that there's more genuinely no good decisions, then I think we're willing to bite that harm on our side of the house. We then also, their extension about why prosecutors are likely to overpressure their victims is ridiculous because prosecutors already have discretion in status quo. So if they don't think they can win a case, they won't take it in the first place. This extension also falls out of the round. Finally, then, comments about the top half. Top half is basically largely about what is best for the victims. But we extend that in a very key way because we consider other victims' interests which could extend beyond them. Because we're able to do that, proud to stand in closing government.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the opposition.
Can everyone hear me? Can people hear me? Yes, good. Okay. And if people could put their POIs in the chat, I'll be sure to take one. Panel, the purpose of prosecution is to seek justice. Justice in terms of equal access to redress, justice for the crimes that are committed, not just against the victim, but against society, justice in terms of fair treatment from the prosecution. 2 points of clash in this debate. All of my rebuttal is going to be interwoven. First, on victims' rights. OG runs your standard principle, right, to veto and avoid trauma, right? We admit that trials can be traumatizing due to their adversarial nature. You might be asked hard and personal questions. 2 contentions that we bring you from closing opposition. First, for the victims that do choose to testify, the process is comparatively much more hostile now because there is the narrative that they had the opportunity to decline to prosecute, but they chose to go ahead with it anyway. This is especially harmful and disempowering in cases where victims are not given much sympathy. A victim who is now seen as like ruining a teenage mugger's life, or a sexual assault victim seen as damaging the swimming career of her rapist, right? On balance, we say that this increased hostility from the defendant leads to a more traumatizing and adversarial trial, and higher levels of scrutiny from the jurors means that victims who are not traditionally seen as sympathetic are even less likely to win. Again, because all of the problems that Viggy tells you that the criminal justice system has are now seen as your fault if you're choosing to undertake this process. On balance, we say that most victims of crimes do want to prosecute, which means you make things far worse for the majority of victims in this case. But second, Even if you believe somehow that the rights of the minority to not testify do not outweigh the rights of the vast majority to a fairer trial, Iman tells you that most of the violent offenders are repeat offenders. OG says they agree. We tell you that two people's rights are better than one's in a POI, and they again agree with this. This means that since failing to testify directly causes future crime in victims, we beat them on this. The unique weighing we give you from CO is not just on numeracy and agency like OO gives, it's on severity. The trauma of testifying, we say, is far less than the trauma of being the victim of a violent crime. And if you let people who are violent criminals just continue without being prosecuted, they will reoffend in the on balance percentage-wise of cases. Second of all, we tell you on their point about civil versus criminal cases, compensation is not mutually exclusive in most systems. You can send the person who stabbed you to prison and then sue them for your hospital bill. If there is a trade-off in Canada's system, it only matters when the perpetrator is wealthy and unrelated to you, where you'll get a settlement, in which case you're probably going to lose in any world if you're a disadvantaged victim of a crime. Third, on the idea that the criminal justice system is unjust and victims ought not send people into it from CG. We tell you that bias of the criminal justice system is not the fault of victims, and the narrative that the victim who chooses to seek justice and healing as they think best, which can be through prosecution, is at fault for the problems in the criminal justice systems, at fault for ruining the perpetrator's life, is incredibly damaging. Whether or not a victim chooses to prosecute, they are now on side gov seen as the reason for any consequences that befall the perpetrator in prison. If the state is indeed as eager to wash its hands of the ills of the criminal justice system as CG says, if the state is as predatory as CG says, we say that the state is probably going to be very eager to blame the lack of rehabilitation on victims, not on their own abject policy failures in the prison system. But let's say that the victim doesn't want to prosecute. And again, we tell you most victims will want to prosecute, and now you are blaming them for everything that happens in the prison system to their perpetrators, creating a further shaming and stigma of victims. But let's say again that the victim doesn't want to prosecute. Cross-apply all of our responses about future victims there. It's not about the victim conscience, whether or not the victim feels guilty. We say all of that is outweighed by the fact that we are preventing future victims from being created, preventing future violent crimes from occurring. That beats all of their material. Final point here on victims' rights is this idea of the victim not reporting. I think that this is probably the strongest argumentation from Gov, but I think that this is first a small number of cases because perpetrators fear, even in status quo, the risk of prosecution and won't let their victim seek medical care after abuse because they still worry that their victim is going to go to the cops or that the doctor is going to call the cops. Second, the narrative that the state doesn't unequivocally stand by victims who do report crime and instead leaves a lot of that journey towards justice up to the victim, that, oh, it's not just the prosecutor holding your hand, helping you through this process. It's going to be you choosing to do this on your own. It's going to be you choosing to do this in a system that you know is really bad to perpetrators, that you're ruining someone's life, is a far greater deterrent to reporting than anything on their side of the house. Second point then, on pressures to use this veto, but first I'll take a POI from OG.
On our side, you are blamed because you didn't drop the case against a priest. On your side, you are blamed because it was your testimony, not the state, that put them away. On both sides, if the victim doesn't want to go forward, it's unlikely you will successfully prosecute. But only on our side does the victim get some restitution and benefit.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's the same. I think that when you're blamed for your testimony, it's different because when you are you are literally compelled to testify, perjury is a crime, you are told that you have to make that testimony. There's a far less lesser degree of agency in that testimony, which is actually a good thing because then people can't blame you for that action in the way that they're going to blame you on your side of the house. I just don't think that equivalence is true. Finally, pressures to use the veto. The winning extension from closing opposition is what Iman tells you, that overworked prosecutors are going to pressure people with difficult to win cases. For example, the sex workers who are sexually assaulted that OG tells you about, or the spouses who only have their word against their partners, to veto prosecution. There's an incentive to do this because of their own workload, first of all, and second of all, because their promotions are tied to the percentage of cases they win. That slam dunk system Viggy tells you about is also our mechanism, and we tell you that it's bad because on balance, perpetrators have more capital and resources than victims of violent crime, who are usually women, racial minorities, people who are physically vulnerable to violence, etc. Not prosecuting a crime the victim wanted prosecuted is the greatest injustice because they have never received compensation for the wrong done to them in the first place, and then they are secondly made a victim again by the state, which means that the state is now no better than the perpetrator itself, right? But second, Iman tells you that this reinforces the narrative that certain victims deserved it because they weren't morally pure, because you never see them achieving justice at a trial, because people in their community are taught to internalize that shame, and the state isn't there for them, so they never demand better. That means that there are spillover effects into social narratives that incentivize crime and disincentivize political accountability to the disadvantaged, and this increases the inequality in the scales of justice like intended to rectify in the first place. Finally, CG runs a case that crime is intimate on a familial level in most cases. We agree. Here's why we beat them on that. Iman tells you that the vast majority of countries in the world are strongly patriarchal societies that engage in extrajudicial justice. Think of like honor killings or even just like corporal punishment. Now, when victims are victims of familial or intimate partner violence, which is the vast majority of violent crime because most people know their attackers, that attacker knows they have the option not to prosecute and is going to pressure them not to prosecute. This goes beyond feeling guilt like OO says. This is your husband threatening to take away your children if you prosecute, if you don't veto the prosecution. Your father saying that if you choose to testify against your husband, he will harm you, because now it is a choice. Again, this also responds to the OGPOI. On our side of the house is the only narrative where you testify and you have the shield of saying it wasn't your choice, that you are able to still get justice without having to take the agency and the responsibility that will cause the types of disproportionate action against you that on their side of the house they get. For all of these reasons, we get better victims' rights. We prevent future victims. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech and everyone for that debate. This is closed adjudication, but please feel free to contact me after the break is announced if you want the result and or feedback.
Yeah, so I'm going to create a breakout room now with the judges. So if people do want to hear the result, then they can wait a few minutes and I'll bring the judges back.
Wait, sorry, is the round open or closed?
The round is closed, so you won't get the result.
Great, thanks for judging.